Okay, so this is in a way a bonus talk, since it is not in any way directly related to the question of the Eurozone or to monetary or macroeconomic issues in general, but it deals with a concept that I think is relevant and applicable to all kinds of economic recessions. And this is the concept of the so-called regime uncertainty. So before I actually say something more about regime uncertainty, I would like to say a few short introductory remarks about the concept of entrepreneurship in general. So there are essentially three ways of thinking about the concept of entrepreneurship in the relevant literature. There is the Schumpeterian tradition, and according to the Schumpeterian tradition, an entrepreneur is an innovator, a pioneer, an inventor of new products, new ways of producing the already existing products, new markets, new organizational structures, and so on. So, according to the Schumpeterian conception of entrepreneurship, the entrepreneur is someone who upsets the existing market equilibrium through the process of what is known as creative destruction. The second tradition of thinking about entrepreneurship is mostly associated with Israel Kirzner, who conceives of entrepreneurship as alertness to profit opportunities, where profit opportunities are essentially understood as price spreads on different markets or within a single market. So, according to this particular conception of entrepreneurship, the entrepreneur is not so much an innovator as he is an arbitrageur. And I essentially see those two theories as complementary. They illustrate different aspects of the same phenomena. They illustrate two different types or two different kinds of entrepreneurship. Some of the people whom we normally associate with the name entrepreneur seem to fit this category to a larger extent than that category. For example, if we think about people like Henry Ford or Steve Jobs, who were creative geniuses, innovators, creators of new products or new organizational managerial structures, they definitely fit this category, and they exerted a disequilibrating effect on the market by making a lot of their competitors obsolete and driving them out of the market and necessitating some kinds of fundamental restructuring in the underlying capital structure. On the other hand, those who follow in the footsteps of the great innovators are those who bring the market back to the state of equilibrium or initiate a countervailing, equilibrating tendency. So those who are able to create cheaper, more widely available substitutes of those pioneering, revolutionary new products, or, for instance, stock market speculators and arbitrageurs, they would fit the category of Kirchnerian entrepreneurs. And there is a third theory, which I essentially think as providing a kind of a unifying linchpin or a unifying theme, which unites both of those conceptions, which is a necessary element of both of those conceptions. And it's a tradition, actually the oldest tradition of thinking about entrepreneurship, which I wouldn't associate with any particular name, but which essentially goes back to Richard Cantillon and his essay on the nature of commerce. But Mises and Rothbard fit this tradition as well. And according to this conception, an indispensable element of all kinds of entrepreneurial activities is uncertainty bearing. Entrepreneurs are those who are able to successfully forecast the uncertain future. And I believe that this particular conception informs both of those conceptions, even if in their original formulations they weren't particularly vocal about the element of uncertainty or weren't particularly emphatic about it. But obviously both the innovators, the pioneers, and the imitators, the alert arbitrageurs and equilibrators who follow in their footsteps, all of them are exposed to uncertainty and have to be able to deal with it effectively. So now let me say a few words about uncertainty, the phenomenon of uncertainty. And the easiest way to illustrate this concept and to describe it is to juxtapose it with a related concept of risk. And there is a very strong, very significant, crucial distinction between risk and uncertainty. Risky events are those can be also characterized or can be also described as class probable events. In other words, risky events belong to homogeneous classes of events within which the probability of occurrence of specific events tends asymptotically towards fixed limits. In other words, when we are dealing with risky events, we already know the probability distribution of events within that particular category. So those are the kinds of events. For example, I mean, the canonical example is throwing dice. When we throw a die, then we know from the outset that there are 6 possible outcomes and the probability of each of them coming up is exactly 1/6. And even if we happen to throw the same number a couple of times, if the die is unbiased, the more we throw it, the more each particular solution or the probability of the occurrence of each particular outcome will tend towards 1/6. So those initial fluctuations will be smoothed out over time. So those are risky events, events that are quantifiable, in principle predictable. So, for instance, they can be the costs associated with them can be estimated in advance and incorporated into one's business plan. So we can insure against them. So this is risk is the kind of phenomenon that insurance brokers, for instance, deal with, or technologists who can estimate that, for example, 1 out of each 100 bottles produced by a bottle factory will break. On the other hand, case probable events are precisely the ones associated with the concept of uncertainty. And those are essentially events that we deal with in the realm of human action. In the realm of human action, there are no constants, or at least there are no constants which are predictable in the way I just described in connection with the concept of risk. There are no algorithmic, formulaic methods that an entrepreneur can employ in order to forecast future consumer wants, future availability of various factors of production, and future technological possibilities. So that's entrepreneurship. Uncertainty bearing is the crucial element of all kinds of entrepreneurial activities. So now let me say something about regime uncertainty. Regime uncertainty is a specific kind of uncertainty. It's not the usual kind of uncertainty, market uncertainty, having to do with the unpredictability, or at least no possibility to predict in any formulaic fashion consumer wants, the availability of factors of production, technological possibilities, and so on. On the contrary, it's the kind of uncertainty associated with the underlying legal framework. It's the uncertainty associated with the kinds of obstacles that bureaucrats and politicians can put in the way of entrepreneurial activities. So this concept of regime uncertainty was essentially developed by economic historian Robert Hicks, who cites it as the main reason why the Great Depression lasted for as long as it did. And he defined regime uncertainty as the kind of uncertainty that business people, inventors, and entrepreneurs feel in the kind of political and legal environment that threatens to tax or regulate their activities to the extent that makes them essentially unprofitable. Now, having defined regime uncertainty, we now confront a very interesting question. What's the problem with regime uncertainty? If we said a moment ago that the essential characteristic of a successful entrepreneur is to be able to bear the uncertain future and to predict the uncertain future, then why should regime uncertainty be some kind of an insurmountable obstacle to successful entrepreneurship? Isn't uncertainty something that entrepreneurship are supposed to be uniquely suited to deal with? So the only satisfactory answer that can be given in this context is the one that can make a meaningful logical distinction between uncertainty or market uncertainty and regime uncertainty. And I think that the most promising answer in this context seems to be that regime uncertainty is not so much qualitatively different from ordinary market uncertainty, but that it operates on a different level, the level that is normally removed from the ambit of entrepreneurial activities or entrepreneurial decision-making. And I think the best way to illustrate this claim is to refer to the hierarchy of levels of social analysis developed by Oliver Williamson, a recent Nobel Prize winner, one of the pioneers of the so-called new institutional economics. So let me sketch this hierarchy for you. So at the very bottom, we have the so-called soft institutions. And examples of such soft institutions would be, for example, customs, traditions, religions. That's the most inflexible, the most stable level the institutional structure that exists in any given society. It changes over time very, very slowly, but it to an important degree determines the structure of preferences of a given society. And it might be said that it determines what might be called informal rules of the game. Then we have a higher level, which is composed of what we might call hard institutions. And examples of hard institutions would be, for example, property rights or the contract law. And they, in a sense, formalize the underlying customs and determine what might be called hard rules of the game or proper rules of the game. So hard institutions, in our example, would be responsible for creating and upholding the necessary legal framework, the kind of legal framework that is necessary for the operation of successful entrepreneurship. Okay, so we have two higher levels of the hierarchy, one of which is composed of different organizational structures. It's the level on which entrepreneurs try to devise the best methods of dealing with transaction costs or economizing on transaction costs or creating the kind of environment where they will be able to experiment with different combinations of factors of production and so on. And finally, the top level is the familiar level of actual entrepreneurial activity, the gist of entrepreneurial activity, which deals with forecasting the uncertain wants of consumers, the future availability of factors of production of different orders, technological possibilities, and so on. And those two top levels constitute what might be called the play of the game. I don't like the term game because we all know that entrepreneurship and market activity is serious business, but that's not a game, but that's how it's defined in the relevant literature. And I think that this distinction and this nomenclature is illustrative enough, so maybe there is something to be said in favor of it, after all. So how does this hierarchy, sketching this hierarchy, helps us to understand or answer this puzzle about regime uncertainty, the puzzle of why entrepreneurs, while they are capable of dealing with so-called ordinary market uncertainty, seem to be unable to deal with regime uncertainty. And since we have defined regime uncertainty as precisely the uncertainty associated with the legal framework within which entrepreneurship operates, with the inability to tell whether they will be able not so much to achieve or generate profits, but to retain those profits as soon as they are generated, we can see that while those two levels, top levels of this institutional hierarchy are subject to entrepreneurial decision-making, those two levels aren't, particularly this level. This level, which is the level of legal decision-making, is in the hands of politicians and bureaucrats. So in order to deal with the kind of uncertainty that arises on this level, entrepreneurs have to engage in what is called political entrepreneurship, that is engaged in lobbying or in placing their informants in the relevant legislative bureaus and so on. And I think this is the answer to the question why what constitutes the qualitative difference between ordinary market uncertainty and regime uncertainty, and what makes the former something that entrepreneurs can easily deal with, whereas at the same time making the latter something that they struggle with. Okay, so the last thing that I would like to mention is how to deal with regime uncertainty, how to eliminate it. Is there any systematic way of eliminating it? And here I think we can develop an additional argument in favor of what can be thought of as the ultimate culmination of spontaneous order theory, or the theory of free enterprise and all of its benefits, the ultimate culmination of the process of substituting economics for politics, namely the establishment of what is variously known as private law society, or a polycentric legal order, or an entrepreneurial competitive legal order. In other words, the kinds of legal order where competing protection and arbitration agencies provide entrepreneurs and their customers with the requisite legal and protective services. And the reason why it seems to me that this is essentially depoliticizing the business of creating legal frameworks is the only way to eliminate regime uncertainty, because in a polycentric legal order, this qualitative distinction between that level and those two levels disappears, because in that kind of a system, entrepreneurs are both in charge of playing the entrepreneurial game and specifying its rules. In other words, they operate on all of those levels. Okay, just to finish it off, I would like to deal with some objections or suggestions that this solution would not necessarily improve upon the solution or the situation that we are familiar with. For example, sometimes someone might suggest that even in such a polycentric competitive legal order, there might arise some agencies, protective or arbitrational agencies, that will try to meddle coercively with business projects that involve no aggression against non-aggressors. However, there exists a vast literature going back to Gustav de Molinari and including such names as the Tannehills and their book Market for Liberty, Rothbard's For a New Liberty, David Friedman's The Machinery of Freedom, which suggests that it is precisely the features of a freely competitive entrepreneurial order that make the kinds of agencies that seem to be antithetical to the promotion of the very features that can sustain such an order subject to ostracism. I mean, in such an order where no agency holds a monopoly over law creation, those activities that increase legal uncertainty rather than reducing it would be ostracized by their clients. They would be met with condemnatory verdicts issued by reputable arbitrators, and they would be driven into bankruptcy. Moreover, if at any given point the existing arbitration agencies become whimsical and unpredictable, so that their services are useless in settling disputes among litigants in a mutually satisfactory manner, the element of competition that is built into the system would immediately trigger the market process of weeding out the incompetent agencies, the one that contribute to legal uncertainty rather than mitigating it, and replacing them with the more trustworthy and skillful ones. Okay, the final point. If in this context one were to suggest that this so-called polycentric law would have to be too fragmented, too chaotic, too diverse, and internally conflicted because of a potentially large number of competing agencies being responsible for its oversight, one needs to remember that all of those agencies in such an order would have an interest in making the general rules that they profess to uphold sufficiently uniform to accurately reflect the shared values and expectations of the society that they would claim to serve. But at the same time, one would have to bear in mind that within this general framework of shared social values and expectations, they would have to adjust their verdicts to the specific circumstances of time and place of any given case, as well as to some fundamental principles of logic and common sense. So, in all likelihood, if such a system were to emerge, it would constitute a combination of an efficiency-enhancing combination of macro-scale fixity and micro-scale flexibility. And in this sense, I think it would be able to address the problem of regime uncertainty in a satisfactory manner, or eliminate its existence altogether. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
So, build the roads. Yeah.
It's not about the roads.
I mean, I'm always having trouble with this regime uncertainty argument. Because so basically what you're saying is that applying this Williamson structure of institutions and then play and rules, we can find a qualitative distinction between traditional uncertainty and regime uncertainty, right? And then if you throw it out, then you don't get the regime uncertainty. But I'm still not really convinced that we have found a really qualitative difference. Because what is the difference? The difference is that it is imposed from non-voluntary actions of people, non-voluntarily on me by actions of other people. That's then the qualitative difference of the hard institutions versus the other stuff.
I think that's one way of understanding it. But
because then, I mean, I wouldn't really see it as really different than traditional uncertainty period. Because what's the difference between getting somebody knocking me on the head with a club and preventing me from doing something, and from thunder striking from heavens and preventing me from doing something, right? Of course, thunder is probably more understandable from the risk perspective, right? So you can do those distributions and think about them. And the thing where you get hit by a club on the head is not. But still, I mean, you could still try doing it as any other insurer does when you insure something relative to human action, which is actually done on the market, right? It's difficult, it's done by proxies, it's not super hot and pure insurance, but it's still insurable when somebody actually does something. It's a bit fuzzy in terms of if it's risk or uncertainty, but I then don't really see a qualitative difference between getting hit on the head by a club and getting struck.
I think an additional element that you forgot to mention is that being hit on the head, I mean, you are mentioning some, accidental, contingent dangers of that kind. Whereas I think that this element of institutionalization is very important here. Because I don't think it's a controversial claim that entrepreneurship, in order to be able to operate effectively, needs to be able to rely on some stable, predictable legal framework. So this element of institutionalization that comes together with stability and predictability is important here and makes the cases I'm talking about different from the cases you're talking about, like of being hit on the head or something like that. I mean, you can insure yourself against that, but still, by insuring yourself against that, you rely on the pre-existing legal framework, but you cannot insure yourself against the legal framework being messed up or being unpredictable because you have a monopolistic enforcer and a monopolistic interpreter over it.
So you're saying that unpredictability is the issue here?
Not unpredictability as such, but the kind of unpredictability that is institutionalized. And which strikes at the very precondition of being able to predict those factors that entrepreneurs have to be able to predict.
But I mean, if you look at an analogy from nature, right? When you discover new laws of nature and understand better something that happens, right? Beforehand, you didn't have a good understanding, for example, why rain comes, and then you get to know some new laws of physics or something, and then something that was unpredictable before becomes predictable, right? And yet, we wouldn't probably argue that before you knew those laws of physics, you were unable to be an entrepreneur because there was some systematic unpredictability, and it was systematic. Of course, it's not institutionalized in a formal sense that somebody says that the rain comes this day, but it's kind of a similar systematic issue, right? You still systematically have an issue of rain, and it's systematically unpredictable until you know certain laws of physics. But will you say that it's then an issue hitting against entrepreneurship? It makes it more difficult.
No,
and I mean, because the biggest problem I always have with Higgs and the explanation for the Great Depression is that we really have to have a qualitative difference. Isn't it enough to say that it just made it harder? I mean, if you look at that entire business cycle theory and that the jigsaw puzzles, right, that you have to reconnect in the right complementary labor, capital, blah, blah, realignment to make it all work, it takes time on its own, even in a purely market economy, more or less, but it takes time. So each thing that you add that makes it more difficult prolongs it, obviously. But do you really have to have a qualitative difference? Wouldn't it be longer if you would have more unpredictable thunderstorms or a bit different world statistically that are just more difficult to predict, right? And just more chaotic? Isn't it enough to say that it's another layer of problems, but it's not qualitatively different?
No, I suppose ultimately it, on some level, reduces to the question of methodological or conceptual tidiness. It's like asking whether a recession or a depression is something qualitatively different than, I don't know, for example, an economic slump of some magnitude. Is there any objective cutoff point between the two?
Yeah, but the point is that if you really say that, there are types that entrepreneurs have problems with, and a type of uncertainty that entrepreneurs have problems with, another that they don't have. That's the point that hurts my brain. Because ultimately,
I would say that it simply, regime uncertainty adds an additional layers of problems that entrepreneurs normally, in quote-unquote normal circumstances, do not have to deal with.
Yeah.
Exactly. And another point that I think can be mentioned in this context is that saying that it's really just a matter of degree rather than a difference of kind, that would imply that, as you said, it simply makes making successful entrepreneurial decisions harder. But that would suggest that it wouldn't affect some entrepreneurs at all. It would just raise the bar higher. And some entrepreneurs wouldn't be able to jump over this bar, but some others would. And I don't think it's the case. I think that the kind of historical research that Higgs did shows that all of the entrepreneurs were affected. To differing extent, but all of them were affected. So it's not just the case that the level of difficulty rose, the bar was higher, and some entrepreneurs were unable to jump over it, but some were, and emerged unscathed.
But then you have skillful regulatory arbitragists, what's the word? People that do arbitrage, and they are very skillful in regulatory arbitrage, and then they actually kind of benefit. They have a competitive advantage in times of regime uncertainty, because they can weasel through you know,
Yeah, sure. But that's why I think, as much as I dislike the term, I think there is some merit in making a distinction between entrepreneurs and political entrepreneurs. And is it not a qualitative difference? I think it is. And the distinction between uncertainty and regime uncertainty would be parallel.
But then that would imply that there is not that actually it is just a raising of the bar and not a qualitative difference in terms of just overall being an entrepreneur. Just you have risen the bar. You need some different competences, but they can manage. Just different people manage and in a different way. Effective.
Yeah, maybe
from a social benefit point of view. Blah blah.
Maybe it's a quantitative, not a qualitative difference in the sense that it simply forces more people to adopt the role of a political entrepreneur. But it is a qualitative difference in the sense that there are those two very distinct roles involved.
That's counts.
Okay, sure. Yeah.